The second major source of international environmental law, or rather general international law, is custom. So what is a custom? A custom is a practice which has some legal effect, which has a legal effect. So that means custom means it is state practice plus that legal effect, which in legal terminology called as opinio juris. It means that the custom is a practice followed by states. Custom in international law or international environmental law is a practice followed by states, and when the state follow that practice, they think that they are legally obliged to follow that practice. So if we combine both these elements, if both these elements are there, for example state practice and this element called opinio juris, that particular practice can be considered as a customary practice or customary law or customary rule. So what is the advantage of this customary rule? Customary rule means it does not have to depend upon any formal agreements. For example, that means it creates obligation for all states. So there are several things, for example, if there is a global custom, a universal custom, all state parties are expected to follow that custom, or that kind of rule is binding upon all state parties. There is only one exception which is recognized under international law, is like this, that exception is that kind of customary rule is not applicable to a state if that particular state has persistently objected to that particular practice. Otherwise, this kind of customary rules are binding upon all state parties irrespective of the fact that whether they have entered into an agreement or not. Like treaties, there are also different kind of customs. Customs could be universal in nature. Regional customs are also recognized under environment in international law. There could be bilateral custom, that means there could be custom between just two countries. In that cases, that particular customary rule is not applicable to other states. Similarly, there can be a custom at the regional level. In that case, that particular customary rule is applicable to that countries in that particular region. But there can also be a universal custom which is binding upon almost all states. The only exception could be this, what we call as persistent objector. However, what kind of role this customary rule or custom has played in terms of the development of international environmental law? As the standard textbook says, like customary law rules have played only a secondary role in international environmental law. That means still, since international environmental law is relatively a new entry in the field of an international law, therefore and the kind of issues they are addressing, because the kind of issues they are addressing, the development of law cannot wait for long. As far as customary rules are concerned, it will take long time to evolve or concretize a customary rule. So that kind of time duration is not available in the case of many environmental issues, because many environmental issues demand immediate action. So that could be one reason why custom still remains as a secondary, or custom still plays a secondary role in international environmental law when compared to treaties. Now the important issue is how we can identify customary rules. There are different sources. For example, one way is to look at various documents where state parties might have repeatedly asserted some rules. For example, one good example of this kind of customary rule is state responsibility for transboundary pollution, which was explicitly recognized by an arbitration tribunal in the tail smelter case. Later on, this was recognized by the International Court of Justice in various cases, for example the Corfu Channel case, and later on from Stockholm Conference onwards, this particular principle has been repeatedly recognized in various instruments. So this could be considered as one proof that almost all states, or at least majority of the states, agree upon this particular rule. So this could be one important, or one reason to consider this particular rule as a customary rule. And another major source of identifying, or the way to identify customary rules, is to look at the cases. Various courts at international level and the tribunals have identified various customary rules. For example, the rule of the procedural rule of environmental impact assessment. International Court of Justice identified or declared this as part of customary international law in a case called Pulp Mills case in the year 2010. Similarly, this reasonable and equitable utilization of shared waters, and this was also recognized as a customary rule, or at least an emerging customary rule, by the International Court of Justice in Gapsikovo-Nagimoro's case in 1997. So that means it is irrelevant whether these principles, whether it is environment impact assessment or the principle of reasonable and equitable utilization of natural resources, or particularly shared water resources. So these principles do not require any particular agreement to establish that these are binding international law rules. Instead, by recognizing these as, or by identifying these as customary rules by the International Court of Justice, I mean, this will be considered as part of customary rules, and when we consider something as customary rules, this is binding upon almost all states unless a particular state or states have been a persistent objector in terms of these rules. In addition to these treaties and customs, we also have several other instruments which are non-binding in nature, but still they play significant role in the development of international environmental law. First of all, there are several other terminologies. For example, the most prominent terminology that is being used in the context of this non-binding instrument is called soft law. This is the origin of this word is as considered as it's opposed to what we call as treaties and customs. For example, treaties and customs are binding, legally binding in nature, whereas these soft laws are non-binding in nature. Or at the most, what we can say is these soft law instruments are of persuasive in nature as opposed to legally binding in nature in the case of treaties and customs. So what are these non-binding instruments? This could be a General Assembly resolution adopted by for example, the United Nations General Assembly resolution. This could be a resolution passed by a major international a conference on environment, or this could be a document adopted by a non-governmental organizations. For example, the Helsinki Rules on the Uses of Waters of International Rivers 1966, adopted by the International Law Association. And this document has been so influential in the development of international law on international rivers. So that means some of these non-binding instruments, even though they are non-binding, they are quite influential and they are quite significant in terms of understanding international environmental law. So what are the benefits? So how do they influence? So what are the benefits of these non-binding instruments? One important advantage of these non-binding instruments are because they influence the future development of international environmental law. For example, the same Helsinki Rules on the Uses of the Waters of International Rivers 1966, adopted by the International Law Association. This document has been significantly influential in the development of law on international rivers, and later on, when the International Law Commission was entrusted with this duty of developing a document on international rivers, they relied on this document significantly. Or to put in a different words, Helsinki Rules was the starting point for the development of what we now have, this document called 1997 Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses. Or another major advantage is repeated assertion, no matter whether this particular soft law or non-binding instrument has eventually culminated into a binding treaty, but repeated assertion of a particular principle in a number of non-binding instruments, that may lead to the concretization of that particular rule as a customary rule. One good example, as I have already pointed out, is the state responsibility for transboundary pollution. So that means these non-binding instruments we need to, or international environmental law students need to consider or need to take these non-binding instruments extremely seriously, because they play an important role in the development of international environmental law. Or many of those rules which are relevant, extremely relevant in the context of international environmental law, we can find it in non-binding instruments, or at least they played crucial roles in the development of that particular rules, or at least in the context of concretizing that rules. Now let us move on to the next important part of this module, that international conferences on environment. An important question to start with is why we need to take international conferences on environment seriously. Before answering this question, let me just point out some of the major international conferences on environment. The first one is the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment 1972, which is popularly known as the Stockholm Conference. The second one is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development 1992, which is known as Rio Conference. World Summit on Sustainable Development 2002, which is known as Johannesburg Summit. And the fourth one is the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development 2012, which is known as Rio Plus 20. Now the question, let's go back to the first question, like what are the roles played by these international conferences, or why an international environmental law student should take these international conferences seriously. First, let's try to identify some of the major contributions made by these international conferences in the development of international law, environmental law, or framing international environmental law rules. For example, many of these soft law instruments or non-binding instruments adopted in these conferences, they highlight key principles of international environmental law. For example, Stockholm Declaration. Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration talks about state responsibility for transboundary harm or transboundary pollution. Principle 22 and 24 of the Stockholm Declaration details about liability rules in the context of environmental pollution or environmental harm. So now look at the contributions made by these principles or this document called Stockholm Declaration. These documents, which arguably took its origin from the trail smelter case, and subsequently it was repeated in all other important non-binding instruments on environmental issues. So that means many of these non-binding instruments or adopted under these international conferences, they play significant role in concretizing certain rules or principles of international environmental law. For example, the state responsibility for transboundary pollution. A second major contribution made by these international conferences are they bring lots of countries together on a common platform to discuss environmental issues, and this may also lead to arrive at a political consensus on different environmental issues. It doesn't matter whether all these consensus lead to the adoption of a binding treaty, but still political consensus itself is very significant as far as the future course of actions are concerned. A third major contribution is many of these international conferences identify different environmental issues for future considerations, or it identifies emerging environmental issues. And another major contribution is it facilitates adoption of multilateral environmental agreements, because many of these international conferences introduces draft documents or draft treaties, and in many instances it leads to or it led to the adoption of multilateral environmental agreement, that means legally binding treaties on various environmental issues. Important examples are Climate Change Convention, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in the Rio Conference. Similarly, the Biodiversity Convention 1992 was adopted in the Rio Conference. Another major or landmark contribution made by these international conferences or a significant change introduced by these international conferences are the participation of non-state parties. And this requires a little background because international law traditionally involved only sovereign states. Non-state parties were alien to the international law making process. In that way, looking at it from that angle, in majority of these international conferences, especially from Rio Conference onwards, it marked significant participation of non-state parties, especially NGOs working on environmental issues. So in that way, it facilitated participation or contributions from non-state parties in the international law making process or international environmental law making process. And this could be considered as a revolutionary change in the field of law making process at the international level, because a domain which used to be exclusive for state parties has now become opened for non-state parties as well. And indeed, these non-state parties are playing significant roles in shaping the environmental law regime at the international level. Another part of the major part of this module is the institutional mechanism, which I highlighted earlier, that there are different kinds of institutional mechanism. For example, one could be an independent institution, say in the case of United Nations Environment Program. Several multilateral environmental treaties depend on this institutional mechanism for their better implementation. And this traditional IGOs, I mean, nowadays this is not very attractive in the case of institutional mechanism for multilateral environmental treaties. Partly the reason is these traditional intergovernmental organizations are very expensive to maintain, and they are also bureaucratic in nature. These are the reasons highlighted in the literature on environmental institutions. In this context, this led to a novel idea of institutional mechanism for better implementation of international environmental law. This is known as conference of parties. Conference of parties, the idea is to have a conference of parties for each multilateral environmental agreements, and this conference of parties, this institutional mechanism is expected to meet regularly to evaluate the implementation or assess the implementation of the treaty, as well as the possible changes that are to be made or additional documents to be prepared or additional documents to be implemented. So it in effect it satisfies or it carries out almost all functions a traditional intergovernmental organization used to do. And to highlight another point, there are very few multilateral environmental agreements concluded since 1972 rely on existing intergovernmental organization for its implementation. Instead, they all follow this idea of conference of parties as an institutional mechanism for the implementation of that particular multilateral environmental agreement. Let me highlight some of these functions of this conference of parties. I may quickly go through some of these functions, like it can establish subsidiary bodies, it makes arrangements for meetings of all state parties, adoption of rules of procedure for itself as well as for subsidiary bodies, providing guidance to subsidiary bodies and secretariat, adopting new protocols, ensuring implementation of and compliance with these multilateral environment agreements. And the subsidiary bodies are also extremely important in the context of environmental issues, because many of these environmental issues are emerging in nature. So probably in the environmental law or its approach has to change or modify according to the new scientific evidences. So in that case, the subsidiary bodies or technical bodies are extremely relevant for better implementation of environmental treaties. So in that way, this flexible or evolving nature of institutional mechanism that helps a lot for a better implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. Now the last important point in this module is to introduce a critical approach towards international environmental law, and this is to look at it from a north-south debate. And this debate is built upon an assumption that all countries are not sharing a common concern, or to put it in a different way, different countries have different interests and different priorities. For example, these industrialized countries, while they advocate for conservation of the environment or protection of environment, developing countries and least developed countries, they argue for more developments. This was quite evident in Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, during the Stockholm conference, that she highlighted this poverty as a major problem, whereas the industrialized nations highlighted protection of environment as an important issue to be considered. So that means different countries follow different interests and their concerns and priorities are different. While some countries focus on protection of environment, mainly industrialized countries, economic development is a major concern for developing countries. And this is reflected in its worst form in the case of climate change law. For example, in the case of the ongoing negotiation or discussion on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the new protocol that is to be adopted, or that is supposed to be adopted under this UNFCCC. Here the problem is, while industrialized countries are arguing for more emission reduction, developing countries are focusing more on economic development that automatically will have more carbon emission. So it's all about a debate on the degree and the extent of liabilities under this climate change law that all countries are supposed to take, or whether there could be a differential degree of international law responsibilities that the state are supposed to follow. And the result of this north-south debate or north-south differences is development has become a major part of environmental discussion, or as some literature cites, international environmental law as by and large has become international law of sustainable development, where the discussion or the discourse on development is, or economic development is, an essential part of the regime. So that means in different countries, these differences in some cases which is justified because of difference in the degree of economic development in various parts. In some cases it creates real impasse in some of the major issues like climate change, where the international community is supposed to take serious immediate actions. So to summarize, what we can see is international environmental law has expanded in its scope dramatically. So what we have seen is international environmental law started from a limited focus on conservation of species, and now we have n number of international treaties covering a range of issues. So that means it has really expanded in its length and breadth. However, even though we have a number of treaties, most of these treaties or some of these treaties are facing serious problem in terms of its effective implementation. So currently the focus is not exclusively on adopting more and more treaties. Instead, the focus of international environmental law regime is how to ensure effective implementation of existing treaties. The last point to be emphasized is, even though environmental issues have been recognized as important issue for international community to address, still the international community could not manage an international organization on environment. Even though there are several literature and scholars have been arguing for an international environmental organization, the international community so far could not manage that. This is a critical point in the context that international community has managed to set up an organization for international trade, or for that matter many other issues. Still, even though environmental issues are extremely relevant, we could not manage an international organization to facilitate cooperation and better implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. Thank you.